Question I'm going to pose to you all. What reforms are you trying to achieve?
The group that is campaigning for reforms, and we're looking at seeing the bill in Parliament tomorrow as it happens, we couldn't have picked a better night to be doing this, are to remove the barriers to recognition of people's gender identity in the law. And the main areas we have focused on are in births, deaths and marriages, where you can't have your gender recognised unless you have surgical intervention, and it has to be precise surgical intervention. I'm aware of some young people who have had some surgical interventions, but it wasn't sufficient to satisfy their doctor and therefore the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages. So there's a reform that has to happen this year because of the marriage reforms last year, and that is to remove the fact from the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act that if you seek to change the gender on your birth certificate and you're married, you have to get divorced. So that's the current law, and it will be the current law until these reforms get passed. So just even if you're in a happy and fulfilling marriage, the requirement is that you must be single in order to change your gender. So that's a sort of slam dunk, that bit of the reform. We know that will happen. But we are saying, I think quite appropriately, that this is a real opportunity to remove other barriers to people's true identity being recognised and for people to be able to live their lives as who they are. So really the major work is in birth, deaths and marriages registration. We've already seen gender come off a whole lot of other documents, off passports, off driver's licence, etc. So it's I think, time that we moved that last step.
Basically, removing that last bit is important. I mean, one of the biggest barriers trans people face is living in your gender that you feel is authentic, and having to come up with ID that says you're of a different gender. Now, this is automatically going to create problems and questions in people's minds, and that's where barriers start to be created. People may have been fine to give you a house or to give you a bank loan or to give you a job or something, and as soon as they see that, they kind of start questioning that. And slowly those things have been eliminated in a number of documents, and we're just taking that a little bit further.
Great.
Reform that we're seeking but will probably not be pursuing in the current legislative frame is to remove the possibility of children born with variations to their sex characteristics. People refer to intersex characteristics. At the moment, it's not uncommon for those babies to be subjected to what's called normalising surgery, so surgery to make them look right. And that surgery, there's an enormous amount of evidence that surgery simply creates more problems into the future for those children and young people and as adults, and they almost inevitably end up having multiple surgical interventions. They lose all sensitivity, often they're sterilised as a result of the surgery, and they haven't consented and they've had no say in it. And so that's the other bit of work that we want to see happen, is the removal of the right for that surgery to be possible until the child is old enough to consent.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very important reforms there, I think. So the next question I've got is, why now? What sort of circumstances have led to this situation at this point? It's
mainly because of the Marriage Act changes that we have to have the reforms done in relation to forced divorce by the 9th of December. That's the 12-month anniversary of the legislation that removed the discriminatory provisions in the Marriage Act. And in effect, what at the moment, the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages has an exemption from discrimination law if they refuse to register a change of gender while people are still married, and that exemption disappears on the 9th of December. And so from that point on, our registrars will be subjected to potential discrimination complaints. So it's really about removing that risk from the statute book. And so that's the timing. I mean, we've known for a long time, for years, there are people who've been lobbying and advocating for this for 30 or more years. And Martine Delaney, who's not with us, has met with every Attorney General for the last 20 years and had promises of reforms that have never happened. It's always not urgent enough. It's always put on the back burner. So we see this as a really important opportunity to take that next step and really get this sorted out now, rather than just doing the no forced divorce and accepting a promise from government that they'll get round to it some other time, which is really what the risk is.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that it really is sort of the culmination of about 30 years of work. So a lot has led to this point.
So there's some people that would say these laws that we're proposing are fairly radical. They don't exist anywhere else. Anybody want to comment about that?
Yeah. Basically, some of these changes are relatively uncommon at this point, but the law has been changing and evolving. As trans people are increasingly recognized, we've gone from situations where you have trans people, the only trans people considered are basically transsexual women who wanted genital surgery. And for a long time, there's been problems with that, in that trans people often feel that there are gatekeepers, that they are only allowed to have such surgeries after a period of a couple of years of, at least, of living as the gender of their choice. And they are continually being examined by psychiatrists. They have to see a psychiatrist regularly for that entire period, and then have a second psychiatrist confirm that and write them letters. And those psychiatrists often demand a certain amount of normative gender performance. For trans women, they will often say to somebody, if they come in a pair of female slacks, and say, why aren't you wearing high heels? Why aren't you wearing a skirt? If you're not doing this, you're not serious, and I won't do that. Well, things moved on. Basically, a lot of trans people have objected to that. As things moved on, there's been more and more recognition. Transgender came into existence as a word in 1965. More and more people said that they were trans, but they didn't really want to fit those normative roles. They were non-binary, or they were simply transgressive within the binary genders. And as things have moved along, people have recognized that the initial requirements for changing legal gender, which were almost all sterilization, genital surgery, and so on, they never applied properly to trans men, for whom such surgeries are outrageously expensive and often very unsatisfactory. When I say outrageously expensive, I'm talking about somewhere in the order of $100,000, $80,000, taking multiple surgeries, and often over a period of months. And so most trans men might have top surgery but not bottom surgery, and then don't fit the description in these legal things. Slowly there's been the recognition that this is unfair, that there's a lot of people who don't necessarily need or want surgery, or at least don't need or want that particular requirement for genital surgery. And so nations, and the UN has been saying for a number of years, over 10 years, that this is wrong, that people should be able to change their gender based on a simple declaration. And increasingly nations have followed that up. Uruguay in 2009 was one of the first to allow people to change gender without psychiatric or medical intervention. and to simply self-declare. That was followed by Argentina in 2012, Denmark in 2014, India in 2014, Malta in 2015, and so on for another 15 countries. And there are another 10 countries at the moment who are currently passing legislation that would say that people can change their gender based on a simple declaration. And this corresponds with the United Nations Human Rights Accords. It corresponds with the Yogyakarta declarations. It has been agreed by UNICEF, UNCTAD, the Committee to Prevent Torture, the Committee for the Rights of People with Disabilities, and so on. It's been agreed by the Commonwealth, it's been agreed by committee after committee. This has been going on for 20 years. I first started doing this 20 years ago when I was in Parliament. Governments just don't want to deal with it. They feel it's too difficult, they put it off. But nation after nation has been doing it. Tasmania is left with some of the most regressive laws that have been around, and it's time to change that.
Thank you, Didi. I'd just like to add that the question was, are these changes radical? I'd like to say that these changes are recommended. So the people who look after people like me and Didi, at the highest level, I guess, which is the World Health Organization and WPATH, they recommend, as part of treatment, legal recognition of a change of gender. So as part of my transition, changing my gender legally makes me more healthy. And that's kind of the world-class, state-of-the-art recommendations from medical professionals.
It has been recognised by Amnesty, by human rights organisations, by psychiatric organisations, psychological organisations. They all basically say transgender people are here, they're real, this is the way to deal with it.